Greetings everyone. I'm going to take you through the process of installing Everlast floor. I encourage you to familiarize yourself with these installation instructions before you begin so you don't end up wasting money and time on redoing it. Note that the mixing and application instructions for Everlast floor is different than the mixing and application instructions for Everlast Cove base. If you get these mixed up and try to mix the floor using the Cove instructions or try to install the Cove using the floor instructions, then your project will be unsuccessful. Also, if you attempt to modify any of the measurements in the mixing instructions, it will not work properly. This video applies both to our Everlast floor and to our Echo floor. The overnight floor, however, has different mixing ratios, so you should still watch this video even if you are installing our overnight floor, as the rest of the procedures apply. But keep in mind that the mixing ratios are different, so print and refer to the overnight floor instructions. There are 4 things to do before you begin. Number 1 is to study this video and also go over the documents provided on our how-to page, www.everlastepoxy.com/how-to. We recommend that you study the 52-page instructions and appendix, then print the 9-page instructions and have them with you on the job site. Number 2 is to be sure that you have all the necessary products and tools. We'll go over that shortly. Number 3 is to be sure that you have properly prepared the substrate. Number 4 is to be sure that you have the right atmospheric conditions to install Everlast floor in. I'll go over all these with you, then we'll get into the installation instructions. Let's look at the product you'll need from us. Everlast floor consists of 3 different materials, Everlast floor Part A and Everlast floor Part B. These are both resins, and it also contains an 8x8 box of aggregate. Everlast Cove base consists of 4 different materials, Everlast Cove Part A and Everlast Cove Part B. These are both resins, and Everlast Cove Part C, this is a fine white powdery substance, and it also contains an 8x8 box of aggregate. Everlast Glaze consists of 2 resins, Everlast Glaze Part A and Everlast Glaze Part B. The floor and glaze resins are color-coded to make it easier to keep them separate. This is in the form of an additional label on the container. Blue, Everlast floor Part A. Red, Everlast floor Part B. Green, Everlast glaze Part A. Yellow, Everlast glaze Part B. Now when you receive an order from us, you'll need to go through it to familiarize yourself with what you have. It's better to do that right away than halfway through the project when you need something. Also, be sure to check that the shipment has everything on the packing list. We can't do anything about it unless you noted on the freight bill if there was anything missing or damaged. This is the paperwork that the delivery driver gets signed at the time he drops off the freight. For each kit of floor and cove, you'll need 1 box of aggregate. So if you ordered 25 kits of floor and 5 kits of cove, you'll get a total of 30 8x8 boxes of aggregate. The aggregate is the same whether for floor or for cove. These boxes will be marked with the color and the dye lot. It is important that you use the same dye lot for a whole room, because the dye lots represent the batches of each color of marble or quartz that was used, and color can vary from batch to batch. So if you run short and need to order some more to finish a project, let us know so we can try to send the same dye lot again. The next thing you do after you unload the truck is to store the material in a warm place. We recommend heating a small room to 80 degrees to store the product in, as it is hard to install Everlast floor when the materials are cold. Everlast floor Part A, the resin with the blue label, comes in either a 1-gallon, short-filled, pre-measured container which contains enough for 1 unit, or a 5¼ gallon pail which contains enough for 7 units. Everlast floor Part B, the resin with the red label, comes in either a quart container which contains enough for 1 unit, or a gallon can which contains enough for 4 units, or a 5-gallon pail which contains enough for 24 units. The Cove base resins are different than the floor resins, and the amounts needed are different too. Part A is 54 ounces of Cove Part A, and Part B is 16 ounces of Cove Part B and Part C. You'll need 1 full container of Cove Part C, which is that white powdery substance. Part C comes in boxes, and each box has multiple units of Cove C along with a container to measure out the Cove C. Be sure that the specially marked measuring container is all the way full. If anything, a heaping container is better than one that is less than full. The glaze also comes in different size containers depending on how much you ordered. Some customers also need Everlast primer, and most customers also get the anti-slip additive, so it's recommended to check in your whole order right away when you receive it. It is important that you use the proper tools. These are listed on our recommended tools section of our how-to webpage. For example, it says you need a clean 5-gallon bucket for every 5 kits. Don't deviate from these instructions by trying to use tools that are not recommended, like where it says to use a 9-amp mixing drill. Don't attempt to use a concrete mixer or an epoxy flooring power mixer. These mixers do not agitate the blend enough, and you will struggle with troweling if you don't use the recommended mixing method. Be sure to get the recommended trowels, as if you attempt to use a cheap trowel, a bowl float or a pool trowel, or a gas-powered concrete power trowel, your end result will be undesirable. Always use safety chemical splash-resistant goggles when mixing resins and use non-permeable gloves whenever handling the material. We also recommend wearing a dust mask when mixing the Cove Base Part C. Have plenty of denatured alcohol or xylene and rags on hand to keep your tools clean as you work. Sticky trowels are hard to use. Make sure to get separate containers for measuring and mixing the A resins and for the B resins. It's helpful to mark these as such. Don't use the same container for different resins. Mark the lines you'll be filling up to. A trick that saves time and helps to avoid costly mistakes is to use a piece of tape and put the top of the tape at the line where the resin is to be poured to. It is easier to see when you are pouring than trying to find the right line while you are holding a heavy bucket. The third thing to do before you start is to be sure that your substrate is properly prepared. There's many different surfaces, such as concrete, wood floors, cement board, vinyl tile, asbestos glue, quarry and ceramic tile, radiant heating systems, to name a few. Every substrate requires a different method of preparation, so I'm not covering this in this video because they do not all apply to you. We have instructions for how to prepare each different substrate on our how-to webpage. I do want to stress the importance of properly preparing your substrate. Most floor failures are a result of poor preparation. Be sure to study the section that describes your substrate. Besides there being different substrates, there are other issues such as FRP wall panels, leftover adhesive residue from the prior flooring, and floor drains. Information on each of these is also provided on our how-to webpage. One thing that does apply to all substrates is to be sure to have an even surface to install Everlast floor on, without any pits or low areas to fill in. Don't attempt to install Everlast floor prior to patching low spots. Attempting to fill low areas with the floor mixture at the same time you are installing the floor will result in, number 1, a very inconsistent finish with resin puddles. Because Everlast floor is a resin-rich system, when it is applied thicker than 1/8 of an inch, what happens is the aggregate will settle and the resin will attempt to seek its own level, resulting in the high spots appearing dry and the low spots appearing as a puddle. Installing over wavy, uneven concrete will result in the finished floor looking wavy. While the floor will be otherwise all right, do understand that your Everlast floor will have a marbleized look and you will see the humps and bumps in the concrete through the coating. Number 2 is loss of coverage. One kit of Everlast floor will yield 25 square feet per kit at 1/8 inches thickness. Improper floor prep will result in excessive material usage. Everlast floor and/or Everlast Cove can be used as a floor patch material, but it must be allowed to cure prior to installing the flooring. Be sure to check the section about the substrate because some surfaces need to be primed with Everlast primer, and the information you need is provided there. Also, when you are installing a light color, you need to prime the substrate with our white primer even if your substrate doesn't otherwise require a primer. This is so you don't have any see-through problems. The last thing to be aware of before you begin installing Everlast floor is the atmospheric conditions. The temperature is important. Everlast floor typically is cured enough to apply glaze in 8 to 12 hours, provided the substrate temperature is above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. In cold weather conditions, it can take much longer to cure. Also, if the substrate is cold, it can take much longer to cure. If the substrate is less than 55 degrees Fahrenheit, then do not attempt to install Everlast floor. If the substrate is between 55 degrees Fahrenheit and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, it can take up to 3 days to cure and could remain sticky until glazed. Between 65 degrees Fahrenheit and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, allow 1 extra day for curing. One more thing is to check that you don't have a cold draft coming in under, down where the cove base is to be installed, or at any exterior doors near where the flooring is to be installed. This needs to be taken care of before you start, because a cold draft will cause the cove base to sag before it cures and will hinder the flooring from curing also. Other important atmospheric conditions, such as hydrostatic pressure, is addressed in detail in our floor prep guide. Cove base should be installed first before installing the floor. The finished cove base should be about 3/16 inch thick, so if the wall where you plan to install cove base is recessed deeper than that, fill it in advance with wallboard, cement board, or plywood. Do not try to make the cove base thicker to fill in an area, as it will be heavy and could slump. Protect the wall finish with blue painter's tape. Begin by priming the surface and then wait for an hour to allow the primer to become tacky. Apply the cove base with a gauge trowel. Leave a little excess at the bottom to form the cove. Then finish it with a cove tool to create a smooth, even finish. After removing the tape, use the gauge trowel to smooth the top edge to ensure that it is smooth. I'm going to walk you through each step. First, make a batch of cove base primer. One cove base primer kit consists of 1 cove part A, 1 cove part B, and 1 cove part C. Pour 54 ounces of cove base part A and 16 ounces of cove base part B together into a 5-gallon bucket. Then add a full measuring container of cove base part C and mix for approximately 90 seconds. Note, cove base part C is a very fine powder, so wear a dust mask. It is helpful to cover the bucket as much as possible while mixing to keep the powder from blowing out. Prime the wall area that gets cove base with this primer. This is best done with a 4-inch paint roller. The primer needs to be tacky before you start installing cove base. This usually takes at least an hour and sometimes much longer in cold or humid conditions. Once the primer is tacky, you can start installing cove base. Just feel the wall first to be sure it is tacky, like a sticky fly trap. Once the primer is tacky, you have about 4 hours or so to work with it until the primer cures and is no longer tacky. Once the primer isn't tacky anymore, then you'll need to reprime. But 4 hours is plenty of time to install 6 kits of cove base. To make the cove base, you first repeat steps 1 and 2 above to blend cove part A, B, and C. Then add a whole box of aggregate to the blend mix until it is fully blended, about 60 seconds. It is best to gradually pour the aggregate into the bucket. Next, you apply the cove base to the wall with a gauge trowel, form the cove, and smooth out the base with a cove trowel. Cove base can also be formed using a gauge trowel and a large dinner spoon for the cove, as the cove trowel is optional. You have about 45 minutes to work with each kit of cove base. After that, it starts gelling and getting hard to use. It helps your knees to use a knee board or knee pads. Don't put it on thicker than 3/16 of an inch, or it will be too heavy to stay on the wall and will fall off. Keeping your tools clean and damp with denatured alcohol is the key here. Sticky tools are not your friend. Leave a clean straight line to butt the floor up to. You want to leave the cove radius intact. Clean away the excess cove material and cut out a straight line just past the cove. After forming the cove base, remove the blue painter's tape with a slow upward pull. Remove the tape after each kit, or the epoxy will harden and the tape will become difficult to remove. Now take your gauge trowel and clean up the top edge to get a nice even finish. Also, even out any ridges that the cove trowel left. Make sure to remove any excess material on the floor so you won't have to scrape it up later. It is best, but not necessary, to wait till the next day before installing the floor. That way the cove base is hard and won't get damaged if you happen to knock into it with a light cord or floor finish trowel. Before you start the cove base, be sure there are no gaps in the drywall. If there are gaps between the drywall and the floor, fill them in and wait for the filler to cure. Otherwise, you will be able to see the gap in your finished cove, and it will look like this. You can also put the cove base material around pipes or other protrusions in the floor. Clean up the floor afterwards so you will have a clean floor to install Everlast floor on. Just don't use your favorite broom because the epoxy will ruin it. After the cove is hard, be sure to scrape up any excess out on the floor. Otherwise, you'll have to fight the chunks while you're trying to trowel the floor. Because this was a plywood floor, we primed it and taped the joints. Be sure to see our floor prep guidelines for your particular floor. Use duct tape at the termination of the floor. You'll remove this just as soon as you're done troweling. Don't leave it here overnight. Mark out a 25 square foot spot for your first couple kits so you can get accustomed to how thick to apply the flooring. If you put it on too thick, the finished product will have shiny spots in the areas that are too thick. Each kit should cover 25 square feet. Have a halogen light next to you while you trowel, even if the room has good lighting already. When preparing to blend the floor, we recommend dumping each full box of aggregate into a bucket because it's easier to pour the aggregate from a 5-gallon bucket into the resin. Remember, it's 1 full box of aggregate per kit. Pour the Everlast Floor Part A, either 1 pre-measured unit or measure out 96 ounces from the 5-gallon bucket, and Everlast Floor Part B, either a pre-measured unit or measure out 28 ounces. You're going to pour these both together into a 5-gallon bucket and mix for 1 minute. Then add the box of aggregate and mix for 1 to 2 minutes. Use a clean bucket after each break or after every 5 kits. Otherwise, the older epoxy left over in the bucket from previous mixes will cause the new epoxy to heat up and gel too fast. Always begin each kit with clean tools and have solvent on hand to keep your trowels clean as you work. After mixing the floor, pour out the entire bucket in a line along the floor. Don't just pour a little at a time as it will harden in the bucket. Do not allow a mixed kit to sit unused for any length of time. Whoever is mixing needs to hold off on making each next kit till the prior batch is troweled. Don't let the person mixing pour the 2 resins together while they wait, because as soon as the 2 resins are poured together, the mix begins the process of heating up and gelling. The kit needs to be poured out right away and spread out with a trowel as soon as it's poured. Then after it's spread, go back and do the necessary finish troweling. Not following this procedure and allowing the material to begin gelling in the bucket or in a pile on the floor will result in loss of coverage and make it hard to trowel. In other words, it will cost you time and money. Once you get it spread out on the floor to cover your 25 square feet, you have at least an hour in which it is still pliable to work with. Note how we leave the bucket upside down for a bit to allow it to empty. Right now he's spreading out the whole kit with a finish trowel. You should get about 25 square feet per kit. Spread it to a thickness of 1/8 of an inch. Use the aggregate as your gauge and spread it to the thickness of the aggregate. If you go thicker than 1/8 of an inch, you'll get less than 25 feet per kit and the finished floor will look like it has puddles. These puddles won't be noticeable today while you are troweling, but tonight the aggregate will settle into the low spots as the resin will attempt to seek its own level, and tomorrow you'll see spots that look like shiny puddles where the low areas in the substrate once were. So it is important to spread it to 25 square feet per kit. If the material sits on the floor for any length of time, you need to mix it up a bit before spreading it. Pick out any oversized rocks or trash that got left on the floor. It is important to keep your tools clean as you work. I like to clean them again after spreading the floor just before I do the finish troweling. Keep a halogen light directly on the floor with you, pointed to the area you are troweling. This helps to see the ridges, high spots or low spots, trowel marks and imperfections so that you can work them out. Everlast floor is not self-leveling, so how you leave it is how it's going to look when it's finished. Use the gauge trowel on the edges next to the cove. Go over the section again with your finished trowel to smooth it out and make it nice and uniform. Long, even, multiple strokes will provide the best results. Occasionally, you will need to add some material to a low spot to fill it in. Remember to pay special attention to the seams between each new bucket of epoxy that you trowel on. After you're finished with each kit, look over it with the halogen light to be sure it looks nice and the aggregate is tight. Add more to the areas where the marble looks like it's not tight or not all touching each other, and be sure there are no trowel marks. You can add more material to just where you need it with your gauge trowel, then work over it again with the finished trowel. Be sure not to leave behind any trowel marks. If you aren't able to do the entire floor in one day and need to create a transition, make a straight line with duct tape, preferably at a doorway, as you will always see a line in the finished floor when you stop and start the next day. Trowel the floor up to the duct tape. Be sure to remove the duct tape as soon as you're done troweling. 24 hours after you install the epoxy, the glaze coat can usually be applied. In cold, under 65 degrees, conditions, the floor could take much longer to dry. Always check the floor before walking on it to make sure it is dry, otherwise you risk pulling out chunks of it with your shoes. Remove stray aggregate that are sticking up out of the floor with a scraper. This is sometimes not necessary depending on the installer. The stray aggregate is usually minimal. Just make sure there are no sharp rocks protruding out of the floor. Also pay close attention to the cove base, as sometimes the top edge is sharp. Go over all the cove base with a rub rock to smooth it out and remove any rough spots. Remove ridges and trowel marks in the floor with the rub rock. When mixing the glaze coat, never mix more than you can use in 7 minutes. If you need to, split your glaze coat into smaller amounts. Mix 2 parts Everlast Glaze Part A with 1 part Everlast Glaze Part B, 2:1 mix ratio. Use a 3 or 4 inch roller to coat the cove base. After the cove base is done, make another batch of glaze for the floor. Pour it out in a line across the floor. Next, use a squeegee to spread the glaze coat across the floor. Broadcast the non-slip evenly into the glazed floor by hand, by flicking it into the air so it fans out and falls to the floor. This guy is showing you the wrong way to do it. This way won't spread it evenly. The correct way is to flick it into the air and let it fan out as it falls down. You do not need to use too much non-slip. 1 quart can cover up to 1,500 square feet of floors. The non-slip is gauged by hand. Use as much as needed to obtain the desired texture. Then, using a 1/4 inch nap roller, back roll the floor. When applying the glaze, wear spiked shoes. This will allow you to work on the floor without damaging the glaze coat. If you do not have spiked shoes, then do not step into the wet glaze. If you do not have spiked shoes, use white-soled shoes, as black soles can mark up the floor when they get wet with glaze or solvents. Some people put duct tape on the bottom of their shoes to prevent them from damaging the new floor while glazing. I hope you have found this video helpful, and be sure to check out the resources on www.everlastepoxy.com/how-to for more information.